afternoon, everyone. Good morning to Professor Ovenden in Oxford. We are very sorry for the technical glitches. For some odd reason, there was no possibility of sharing the slides that were covered. Welcome to the second lecture of Citing Vulnerabilities 4 series. Our speaker for today is Professor Richard Ovenden, Director of the Library Bodleian, University of Oxford. Thanks to all of you for joining and the patience which you have put up with the glitches. Over to Atul Kumar for formal welcome to Professor Ovenden.
Professor Richard Ovenden has been a Bodleian librarian, University of Oxford, since 2014, and head of Gardens, Libraries and Museums since 2022. Prior to this, he has held positions at Durham University Library, the House of Lords Library, the National Library of Scotland, and the University of Edinburgh. He was educated at the University of Durham and University College London, and holds a professorial fellowship at Balliol College in Oxford. He was awarded the OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours 2019. He serves as president of the Digital Preservation Coalition and holds fellowships of the Royal Historical Society, the Society of Antiquaries, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and has been elected to both the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was made an honorary Doctor of Letters by Durham University in 2024. He writes extensively on libraries, archives, and information management, and has published a photograph on the 19th century Scottish photographer John Thompson, who edited the massive 17th century library catalogue of Edmund J., who edited a volume of essays honoring the writer and editor Christopher Tolkien, and most recently is the author of A History of Knowledge Under Attack, published in 2020, which was BBC Radio 4 shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize in 2021. He writes regularly with Financial Times, The Atlantic, and Prospect. With this, over to you, Professor Ovenden.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I think for me the audio was quite broken, but excellent, good. Well. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak with you this afternoon. My topic, as you will have heard, is based on my book called Burning the Books, which was published in 2020. And I've tried to, in this presentation, bring it up to date with more recent examples of the deliberate destruction on knowledge or just simply attacks on knowledge. And could we have the next slide, please? And really, my thesis for you today is based on the statement by the great French philosopher Jacques Derrida in his Archive Fever that there is no political power without power over the archive. Next slide, please. So we're going to begin with a brief historical survey. This is not a complete account of attacks on knowledge in the past, but a few case studies. And I'd like to begin by going back to the ancient civilizations of the ancient world in Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq, Iran, Syria, where the first libraries and archives were known to have been created. Next slide, please. And you can see, for example, that there were very well organized libraries and archives, ones which we would understand very well today with both the physical organization of knowledge in the form of clay tablets that had a language system, in this case called cuneiform, to record different languages such as Hittite, Akkadian, and so on. And that those knowledge systems, archive rooms, were often located in temples. And so there's a very a religious connotation between the organization and preservation of knowledge and there's a kind of sacred connotations with that task. Next slide, please. And we actually know quite a lot about the ancient libraries of the Mesopotamian civilizations, thanks to their preservation in archaeological sites and due to the excavation of those sites, which really began in the middle of the 19th century in central Iraq, particularly focused on the ancient kingdoms of Assyria and Babylonia, where there were a wide variety of libraries and archives have been preserved. And in particular, in the middle of the 19th century, a British archaeologist, explorer, colonial administrator called Austin Layard embarked on large-scale excavations in the city and royal palace of Nineveh in central Iraq, just outside of modern-day Mosul. And in those excavations, he uncovered a great library, the library of Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, arguably the earliest library known to try to encompass the entirety of human knowledge. And most of that library is today in the British Museum because Layard brought many of his finds out of what was then part of the Ottoman Empire and what is now modern-day Iraq to London, to the British Museum. And you can see on the left-hand side of your screen that there are actually over 20,000 clay tablets that form the library of Ashurbanipal. Next slide, please. And this is a 19th century artist depicting the destruction of Nineveh, which took place in the 7th century before the Christian era. But what we know about those ancient libraries, particularly the Library of Ashurbanipal, because remarkably correspondence survives, and that correspondence tells us that Ashurbanipal was attacking the library of his neighbors, particularly from the kingdom of Babylonia, the great enemies of Assyria, and seizing knowledge from those neighboring libraries. And this idea that you could make your enemies weaker by taking knowledge from them and at the same time make yourself stronger. And particularly because many of the texts in those libraries that Ashurbanipal was anxious to obtain had the subject of the prediction of the future. So they were astronomy, astrology, divination, and the idea that if you removed the power to predict the future from your enemy, it would make them weaker and yourself stronger. So that's the kind of key idea here. Next slide, please. We also know quite a lot about arguably the greatest library of the ancient world, the Library of Alexandria in modern-day Egypt, which at the time it was formed from the 5th century before the Christian era, was part of the Hellenistic kingdom, the Greek empire, effectively. And we know that there were a number of important librarians there. We know that the library was the greatest to have been assembled in the ancient world. Many ancient writers comment on this, but also that there were many important books and texts that were created in the library that are still being consulted today. And perhaps the best example of that is Euclid's Elements of Geometry, one of the foundational texts of modern mathematics, which Euclid wrote while he was in the Library of Alexandria. And in the Bodleian, we have the oldest surviving example of Euclid's Elements in a copy made in the 9th century of the Christian era. So, 1,000 years after more than 1,000 years after the text was created, but still the earliest witness that we have. if you'd like to move on to the next slide. And here is a 19th century depiction of what was thought to have befallen the Library of Alexandria, which is that it was destroyed in a great conflagration. But we now know that that is actually a myth, that there was no single event that destroyed this great library, that actually the library was neglected over time. It was founded in the 5th century before the Christian era as a great symbol of royal and state prestige. It enjoyed the patronage of the king of the ruling Ptolemaic dynasty of Alexandria, but over time it stopped being a priority for the state, for the rulers of Alexandria, and it had its funding and support diminished to the extent that in the 4th century of the Christian era, the library had vanished. And if you go to Alexandria today, there's even no archaeological site. And I think the message here is about neglect, that knowledge can be destroyed, not just by violence or by seizure, but by neglect. Next slide, please. I'd like to move forward in time to another moment in history where there was great destruction of knowledge, this time in the Reformation of the great upheaval in religious ideas in Europe in the 16th century. And I took this photograph at the site of an abbey in England, in a place called Glastonbury, which in the Middle Ages was one of the richest religious institutions in England and had a great library. And now all that remains of the abbey are these ruins. And that's because of the destruction of the abbey and of the library in the middle of the 16th century. If you'd like to, next slide. And we know quite a lot about the Library of Glastonbury because of an individual called John Leland, who was appointed by King Henry VIII to survey the libraries in England to help him acquire knowledge that would help Henry argue for the divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to allow him to marry the beautiful young courtier Anne Boleyn. And Leland visited all those libraries, and he left notes of the contents of the libraries that he visited, and his archive is in the Bodleian Library today. And you can see on the left-hand side of your screen a list of the books that Leland saw in the Library of Glastonbury Abbey in 1533. In the bottom of that list, you can just see that he writes an entry that says Grammatica Uticis, it's in Latin, Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. And on the right is that actual book. So we know that John Leland consulted this book, which is known as the Class Book of St. Dunstan. It's actually an assembly of texts, including works on grammar that were written in the 8th century. And that actual book survives today, also in the Bodleian, but it's only one of about 60 books that we know to have been in the Library of Glastonbury Abbey on the eve of the Reformation, out of a total of probably between 2,000 and 3,000 books. So only 60 survive, almost certainly more than 2,000 were destroyed. If you'd like to, next slide, please. And the same thing actually happened in Oxford, where I'm speaking to you from today. And you can see a picture of the earliest university library, or the building that was created in the 14th century, so just over 700 years ago, in a structure that still survives. Next slide. And that library, the original university library, moved to a new purpose-built building in the 15th century, and that building still survives. It's known today as Duke Humphrey's Library because there was a great gift of books from Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the brother of King Henry V to the university, and they needed a bigger room to accommodate all of those books. Next slide, please. And actually what happened in the middle of the 16th century during the Reformation was, again, that the library was targeted and that the books were taken out and destroyed by the Protestant reformers, and the pages of those books, which were mostly had been compiled in Catholic Europe, so they were religious, there was an ideological divide, that's why they were targeted. And the pages of those books were torn out and sold to butter makers to wrap butter in, or pie makers to line pie dishes, or in this case, to bookbinders for the new technology of print to strengthen the bindings of those books. And you can see some fragments from the original medieval library of Oxford that were used as scrap by bookbinders to strengthen those book bindings. Next slide. And it actually, that moment of destruction triggered in the mind of a man called Sir Thomas Bodley, who was a rich merchant who served as an ambassador in the court of Elizabeth I, who came back to Oxford and refounded the library some 30 years after the Reformation, as a response to the destruction. Even though he was Protestant, he regretted the destruction of knowledge that had happened in the generation before, and he dedicated himself to re-establishing the university library. Next slide, please. You can see this is part of one of the strong cupboards in the library that was designed to protect the contents. And the focus of Bodley's new library, it's the institution I'm responsible for today, it's still in existence, was a major focus on preservation. And my argument to you is that the preservation of knowledge, there is a kind of strong human instinct to preserve knowledge and to keep it alive and to pass it from one generation to the next. And we see that in the systems of the organization and preservation of knowledge, like libraries and archives. Next slide. And in the library, that focus on preservation actually had other expressions. For example, my predecessor, the second librarian, who's called John Rouse, he's in the middle of your screen, was great friends with the poet John Milton. And Milton presented a copy of his works to the library with a special dedicated inscription. But Milton, in the middle of the 17th century, was also somebody who was opposed to the authoritarian rule of King Charles I, and in 1649 had signed his death warrant. And when the monarchy was restored in 1660, Milton was on a list of individuals who were targeted by the king. They were known as the regicides, and their books were ordered to be burned in various locations in England, including in Oxford. But my predecessor, the fifth librarian, who had inherited responsibility for the books of Milton, along with the rest of the library's collections, refused to give the book up to be destroyed, and he hid it from the royal authorities and must have risked his own life in doing so. Next slide, please. I'm going to move forward in time to the early 19th century, and this time to North America. And you can see this figure called Admiral George Cockburn, who led a British expeditionary force to try and take back the American colonies in 1812. And I'd like to focus on the scenes in the back of this engraving. Next slide. Which is actually the burning of Washington, D.C. that took place in 1814. Next slide. And what happened, we know what happened then, because there was an eyewitness account. This was from a man, a British man in the British Army called George Gleig, who wrote that a noble library, several printing offices, and all the National Archives were committed to the flames, which no doubt the property of government might better have been spared. So basically, Washington was seized, was besieged by the British Army in 1814, and they eventually entered the city and found the Capitol building, which was the only stone-built building in the city at the time. Washington had only been founded in 1800. And in August 1814, they put the city much of the city was burned, including the Capitol building. And the Capitol building contained the Library of Congress and the National Archives of the United States. Next slide, please. And here you can see a watercolor illustration of the Capitol building after the fire, and you can see the kind of soot from the flames out of the windows. And of course, there were 5,000 books in the library, which were highly combustible material. Next slide. Again, there was another response to the destruction of the library, and this time was to renew and rebuild the library. And that was formed by Thomas Jefferson, who of course was one of the architects of the American Constitution, one of the first presidents of the United States. And he had retired to his estate in Monticello in Virginia, just outside of Washington, and he heard about the siege of Washington and the burning of the Library of Congress. And he wrote a letter of outrage offering to rebuild the library to replace its burned collections from his own library. Not as a gift, but as at a discounted price, which eventually Congress agreed to purchase about 7,000 books from Thomas Jefferson, which eventually formed the beginnings of the renewed Library of Congress, arguably the largest library on the planet today. Next slide. I'd like to again fast forward in time, this time to the Holocaust during World War II in Europe, and to the country of Lithuania, and to the city of Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, which on the eve of World War II had a very large Jewish community, and it was an intellectual community. Vilnius was, or Vilna as it was known at the time, was famous for its learned rabbis, but also famous for its Jewish libraries, like the Strashun Library on the right of your screen. Next slide. And the Strashun Library had a learned librarian called Chaiko Lunsky, and a active reading room, and a busy, a strong community of readers who came to use the library. Next slide. And there was another institution in the city called YIVO, which was an institution founded in the 1920s to try and document the ordinary life of the Jewish communities in Lithuania and in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And that had, again, a very active community, and was focused on preserving knowledge in the Yiddish language, the language of ordinary Jewish life, as opposed to Hebrew, which was the language of religious life. Next slide. And the YIVO Institute's archive included things like theatre posters, medical case notes, diaries, again, all in the Yiddish language. Next slide. So in 1933, the Nazis had begun their war on knowledge, particularly on Jewish knowledge, and with a famous book burning in the center of Berlin on the 10th of May 1933, organized and orchestrated and filmed by Joseph Goebbels, the head of propaganda for the Nazi Party, where local Jewish libraries in synagogues had their books seized and set on fire, surrounded by students who were chanting an account of celebrating the destruction of those books. Next slide. And after Operation Barbarossa, that turned the Nazi army eastwards with an invasion of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, alongside the stormtroopers came a kind of cultural stormtrooper. And this idea of attacking knowledge in the cities of occupied Europe was brought forward by the man on the left of your screen, who's called Alfred Rosenberg, who established an institute, a kind of perverted research institute for the study of the Jewish question. And he appointed a librarian, the man on the right of your screen, called Johannes Poole, whose job it was to seize the books and documents in the occupied cities of Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. And those books that Johannes Poole and his team seized were then to be sent back to Rosenberg's Institute in Frankfurt. And here we can see how in Vilna, after the ghetto was formed, when Vilna fled to the German army, well, all of the Jews were forced into a segregated part of the city, and librarians and archivists were identified in the ghetto and forced at gunpoint to come out of the ghetto each day to sort through the captured libraries and archives for material to be sent back to the Rosenberg Institute in Frankfurt, with the remainder to be sent to paper mills for destruction. And of course, to any librarian or archivist, this is a terrible thing to be forced to do, to destroy your own collection by either sending it away to the land of your enemy, or for it to be destroyed in paper mills. And the individuals, the Jews who were forced to do this task, decided to try and save as much as they possibly could by smuggling books and documents back into the ghetto at the end of each day, risking their own lives as they did so. And they began to be known as the Paper Brigade, both by the Nazi guards, but by themselves. And they hid a huge number of documents in the ghetto, hoping that after the war, that these documents would be discovered again. Next slide, please. And unbeknownst to them, the same impulse to preserve, to bear witness, to keep a record of Jewish life was happening in other cities, including in Warsaw, where a man called Emanuel Ringelblum in the Warsaw ghetto tried to accumulate and preserve documents that provided a record of life in the Warsaw ghetto. And again, these were hidden in underground chambers and only discovered after the war, when the ruins of Warsaw were being sought through to rebuild the city, and caches of these documents were discovered. Next slide. And here you can see Emanuel Ringelblum and the milk cartons and other metal canisters that the documents were from what's known as the Oyneg Shabes archive were kept in. Next slide. Now, at the end of the war, the Frankfurt Institute was overrun by American troops, and they tried to find the true owners, the original owners of the documents, for them to be sent back to. And the YIVO Institute had established a very small office in New York, where there was a large Jewish community, and they received an enormous transfer of documents from the Frankfurt library, thanks to the American troops. And here you can see in I think in 1946, staff of the YIVO Institute in New York receiving those packing cases from Frankfurt. Next slide. And the YIVO Institute is still in existence in New York, and here are those documents in modern archival conditions. Next slide. But back in Lithuania, in Vilnius, the documents that had been hidden in the Vilna ghetto were uncovered when the Nazi troops were pushed out by Soviet troops. And the YIVO Institute, just for a short period of time, was re-established with its reunited documents and library, only for them to be regarded as anti-communist by the communist authorities and sent once again to the paper mills for destruction. And this time, a Lithuanian librarian, Antanas Ulpis, who is on your screen, discovered what was happening, went out to the paper mills, drove the vans back and hid the books and documents in an outpost of the National Library of Lithuania that he was responsible for in a disused cathedral, even hiding documents in the organ pipes. And these were only revealed after the fall of communism in 1989. And those documents are now being digitized by the YIVO Institute in New York and the National Library of Lithuania. Next slide, please. In 1992, in more recent years, in Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia, during the Balkans conflict, where Serbia attacked Bosnia, seeking to overtake the country and to establish Soviet rule, a Serbian rule, and they besieged the city of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, and targeted the National Library of Bosnia on August the 25th, 1992, with incendiary shells. No other buildings were targeted that day. It was deliberate attack to eradicate the national memory of Bosnia, particularly because the library contained Muslim texts, Jewish texts, and Christian texts together. So this idea of multiculturalism was what the Serbs wanted to destroy. And on that day, not only was the building attacked, but the librarians and firefighters trying to rescue collections from the burning building were attacked by snipers. Next slide. And one of those librarians, Ada Butarovic, was murdered by Serb snipers that day. Next slide. And that heralded an attack on libraries and archives across Bosnia and Kosovo during the 1990s by the Serb forces, including trying to destroy land registries to try to eradicate any sense that Muslims had owned property in Bosnia. Next slide, please. And eventually, Slobodan Milosevic and Ratko Mladic, the leaders of the Serb initiative, were arrested and held in front of the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague and indicted with charges which included the destruction of the National Library of of Bosnia and other libraries in Bosnia and Kosovo. Next slide. I'd like to bring us up to date for the second part of my talk with what's happening in the regime of knowledge today. Next slide. And so here are, again, a few examples of much more recent attacks on knowledge. For example, in Afghanistan, when the Taliban took control in August 2021, one of the first things they did was to destroy libraries that had been rebuilt in the previous decade since the first Taliban rule ended, and especially libraries for women and young children were attacked and destroyed. And I wrote about this in an article in the Financial Times. Next slide, please. And this time it's picking up the theme of neglect, like the Library of Alexandria. This time the website of the Supreme Court of the United States in 2011, a survey done by the Harvard Law Library, discovered that no fewer than 40% of the web links on that website were broken due to neglect. And, you know, it's my comment here is that it's essential for a democratic society to have access to the laws of the land, to be aware of what the laws of the land are. So not having a functional website for the Supreme Court opinions where the judgments of the Supreme Court are made available undermines democracy through suppressing the free flow of information to the citizens. Next slide, please. And to also on the theme of neglect, in Britain recently, the website of the British Library, in fact, all of their digital domain were attacked by cyber attackers, and the British Library is still trying to recover its services. Fortunately, its collections were protected by firewall, but the services, the application layer, was almost completely disabled. Next slide, please. And again, on the theme of neglect, again, in this country, I've written recently in Prospect magazine about the decline of funding for public libraries. Over the last decade, more than 500 public library branches have closed in Britain. And I, in this piece in Prospect magazine last year, I was arguing for government attention onto the importance of public libraries. Next slide. And again, it's been very interesting to see how the domain of knowledge through commercial communication platforms, particularly with encrypted platforms like WhatsApp, have become used extensively in society, but also in government, where in the UK during the COVID-19 crisis, policy was being developed by politicians, civil servants, special advisors to politicians using WhatsApp. And I've argued that those messages should have been brought under the framework of the 1958 Public Records Act, because they describe, because they document the formulation of government policy, and therefore should be subject to other parts of the legislative arrangements around archives, like freedom of information, as well as for long-term retention for the National Archives. And of course, the use of WhatsApp is actually what brought Boris Johnson's government down, because of their attempts to avoid scrutiny over the so-called parties that were held during the lockdown periods. Next slide, please. And of course, we saw during the first of the Donald Trump presidential regimes that his use of Twitter was of profound importance in his ability to control government and to control public opinion, but also that there were activist archive groups like FactBase, for example, that automatically screenshotted all of his tweets, keeping a record of all of those that were deleted, or either by him or by his team, after having been sent often in the middle of the night. And so that a complete record of those does actually survive, even though they're not available through the National Archives of the United States. Next slide. And of course, so much of knowledge in today's age is created on the big social media platforms and other digital platforms that are provided by the big commercial digital companies across the globe, and that these companies, they've been called private superpowers because they have so much power and so much wealth, but they do not have the preservation of knowledge in their business models. And so Facebook, for example, there is no archival function of Facebook. Next slide. But some libraries and archives are attempting to try to keep a record of what is transacted on Facebook, like the National Library of New Zealand through its project inviting New Zealanders to donate their Facebook feeds to the National Library. Next slide, please. And I think, for example, when Twitter was bought by Elon Musk, there was a great deal of concern that Twitter's own future, or X, of course, as it is now known, could be in jeopardy. And I think that highlighted the sense of how much of modern history, of public affairs, of all manner of public interactions with knowledge were being played out on the big social media platforms. Next slide, please. And we've seen in more recent months just how government policy in the second of the Trump presidential runs is now affecting these big knowledge platforms like Facebook, and how, for example, that link between the state and the technology providers is becoming increasingly close, and that is in order to control the domain of knowledge for political and ideological reasons. Next slide, please. And we're also seeing with the advent of AI just how much knowledge the new technologies like AI need in order to be able to function. And we're increasingly seeing the big AI platforms hit what is being called the data frontier, as they are exhausting the amount of knowledge available on the World Wide Web, which is where they've been training their algorithms. Next slide. And we're also seeing this, the role of AI and knowledge becoming an increasingly contested political one. For example, in this country, this is just a screenshot from a couple of months ago, where the role of public health information, which is very sensitive. Many individuals are very nervous about their own public health information being shared with commercial entities because of the impact it might have, for example, on health insurance and those kinds of issues. Next slide, please. And again, I think there was a very interesting article in the Financial Times recently highlighting the closeness of the current Trump regime with the heads of the major technology companies in the United States, which of course many of those companies are global companies now, of course. Next slide, please. And we saw with Trump himself during his first regime just how interested he was in knowledge. For example, illegally taking classified records out of the White House after he left office, and storing them in this case in one of the guest bathrooms in Mar-a-Lago, which brought a legal action against him. Next slide, please. And that legal action from the National Archives left a mark in Trump's mind, and he has recently sacked the National Archivist of the United States and replaced her with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. So the executive branch of government now has complete control over the National Archives of the United States, over the national memory, obviously raising the concern that those records may be subject to, again, further political and ideological intervention. Next slide. And I think before my final comments, I'd just like to leave you with this quote from George Orwell and his famous dystopian novel, 1984, a line which really I think speaks to the current moment that we're living in about the destruction of knowledge, or the attacks on knowledge, in order to present alternative information or an alternative view of the world by destroying past knowledge. Next slide, please. And so my thoughts that I really want to leave you with are around the place of libraries and archives as the infrastructure of democracy. And I have 5 reasons why I believe libraries and archives provide that function. Next slide, please. The first of these is most obviously about education. Libraries provide resources, facilities, a framework, an environment for educating its citizens, either individually or as society as a whole. Next slide, please. And, you know, some of that educational function you see, for example, in Britain, during the movement to extend voting for women, that Sylvia Pankhurst, one of the leading suffragettes, sought to have access to the library of the British Museum, what is now the British Library, in order to educate herself about the employment of women and the legal frameworks around that. Next slide, please. And here in the Bodleian, this is an example of us teaching students from schools that do not normally send their pupils to apply for a place to study at Oxford University. In this case, we're teaching them about the idea of democracy itself through one of our original copies of Magna Carta. Next slide, please. And we saw, we can also see the role that knowledge plays for the health of society and preserving historic knowledge in cases like the pursuit of child sexual abuse cases and the prosecution of the perpetrators of child sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church in America, where a group of investigative journalists were able to track down the movement of priests who were abusing children through documents kept in libraries, parish registers, parish newsletters, clerical directories, those kinds of things, often very much out of date and in many ways kind of dull and boring documents, but they contained absolutely vital evidence, which the passage of time only proved. Next slide, please. The second of my functions of libraries, there are 5 of them, is the preservation of the rights of citizens. Next slide, please. And here, I think the experience of the fall of the communist era in Europe, particularly in East Germany, when ordinary citizens sought to prevent Stasi officials, the secret police, from destroying files of evidence that they had kept through covert surveillance on individuals, in order to be able to identify who had been spying on them. And that happened across East Germany and in other former communist countries. And in Germany, a special archives legislation was developed in order to give the rights of citizens to have access to their own secret police files. Next slide, please. In an age of misinformation and disinformation from online, it's important that there are institutions for society that become reference points for facts and truth. Next slide, please. And it comes back to one of the old functions of libraries, one of the very traditional functions of libraries, which hold information or knowledge for society which others can go and verify. And if you cite those sources, they can be checked and verified by others. And that's like a fundamental backbone of scholarship, of science, and I think it's an absolutely critical function that libraries play. Always verify your references. This is a kind of 19th century quote from one of the great academics in Oxford University. Next slide, please. And we see that today, not just with the shelf marks of books and documents in libraries, but in the online world of information with persistent identifiers, DOIs, PEARLs, ARCs, other forms of persistent identification online. Next slide, please. The fourth function is that libraries and archives support the identity of individuals and of society and of communities. Next slide, please. And you only need to see what is happening in Ukraine or indeed in Gaza at the moment to see how important it is for those communities to preserve knowledge, and how much the occupying forces want to destroy knowledge, where, for example, in Ukraine, books in Ukrainian in Russian occupied territories are being destroyed, being burned in the street by Russian forces. Next slide, please. And I've written about this in an article in The Atlantic magazine last year, if you want to look more of this up. Next slide, please. And this slide is in fact a little out of date, but you can just see the scale of the destruction of libraries and archives across Ukraine since the illegal Russian aggression of 2022. Next slide, please. The final function of libraries and archives for society that I'd like to leave you with is the importance of a diversity of knowledge that libraries are able to bring. Next slide. And we see that in America at the moment, where there is an epidemic of book banning, which is ideologically and politically motivated. Next slide, please. Particularly in public and school libraries. And this is often fueled by conservative groups who impose objections and try to enforce legal bans on the content of libraries, a form of censorship. Next slide, please. Even to the extent which famous writers, award-winning writers like Margaret Atwood, have had their books banned, for example, in the entire state of Utah. And she's written again in The Atlantic magazine recently to say, in many ways, this just makes her books more popular and makes more people want to read them. Next slide, please. And it's even got to the extent that in North Carolina, a phenomenon known as Banned Books Week, which is established by anti-censorship groups to highlight the dangers of banning books. Even Banned Book Weeks there was an attempt to ban Banned Books Week. Next slide, please. And we're also seeing that in the UK with attempts to ban books in libraries that concern, different sexual preferences. Next slide, please. But what we are seeing again is that motivation, that human motivation for the preservation of knowledge. Library and archive groups are forming networks and campaigns to resist the banning of books and resist that form of censorship. Next slide, please. And in many cases, they're overturning those legal bans and setting new legal precedents. Next slide, please. And we're seeing in some states a kind of reaction against it to actually fund libraries more, to enable a greater diversity of knowledge to be held in those libraries. Next slide. And even some libraries, like the Brooklyn Public Library in New York, digitizing banned books to make them available across state boundaries. Next slide, please. And I think there are kind of fundamental, legal and philosophical positions that support the role of libraries in providing a diversity of knowledge for their communities, such as that, the great kind of work of liberal philosophy, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, or more recently in the Harvard philosopher John Rawls's Theory of Justice, and also in his more recent work, Political Liberalism. where they both Mill and Rawls call for this idea that only democratic societies have to have a diversity of knowledge in order to enable their citizens to engage in the democratic process, particularly a deliberative democratic process, and to engage with the institutions of democracy. Next slide, please. And that's the end of my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Professor Ovenden. That was fascinating. We have questions from the audience. Roy has a question. Please go ahead, Roy.
Thank you, Professor Ovenden. That was very enlightening. You mentioned that there's a human instinct to preserve knowledge. So, my question is whether there's a contrasting human instinct to voyeuristically watch knowledge being destroyed. While the Nazis were burning books in Germany, Princeton librarian suggested that in the US they should pulp the books instead of burning them, because burning causes regressive spectacle. But what this resulted in is that even pulping evolved into a spectacle, because shredders were installed in bookshops, publicly visible areas, and large amounts of copies of Hitler's autobiography were again thrown into the shredders. So even the counter spectacle becomes an exercise in voyeurism. And this is also true for the present Trump administration, taking down information related to LGBTQ people from medical websites and then making it as news. So even though taking down the news itself is not conspicuous, the spreading of the propaganda, again, it provides way for voyeurism, online voyeurism. So, my question was about the voyeuristic instinct to see knowledge being destroyed, whether such an instinct can be said to exist. Thank you, sir.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not so sure. Is the destruction of knowledge a human instinct as well as the preservation of knowledge? I think that's your question. And to some extent, I think you're right, but I think there are particular reasons for the motivations of those who wish to destroy knowledge are, one of the things I explore in my book. They can be ideological, cultural, political, and ultimately they're about authoritarian control. They're about imposing ideas on others, whereas the instinct to preserve is a much kind of broader, more, I would argue, a kind of more humane instinct, which is to allow others to make decisions about accessing that knowledge. For example, in the book banning in America, the arguments that are made by those who oppose book banning is that no one is forcing anyone to read any of the banned books. Whereas those who want to ban books are forcing or denying the right to read. And that only free societies, free societies enable people to read freely.
Thank you, sir.
If you have questions, please type it on the chat box. We have some technical glitch with the audio. If you could type it on the chat box.
Can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Professor, thanks for such a wonderful presentation, actually. I have few questions, actually. So how do historical forms of knowledge destruction, example, burning of libraries, what you have mentioned, iconoclasm, compare with contemporary digital threats like cyber attacks, deplatformization, and algorithmic erasures? Are these attacks part of the continuum, or they signal a paradigm shift? And what implications do you think arise from framing the destruction of knowledge over the 300 years span? How might this longitudinal perspective challenge or enrich our understanding of archival vulnerability and collective memory?
So thank you. They're two excellent questions. I mean, I do see that, both the kind of the control of knowledge in the digital world and the destruction of libraries in the ancient world and across the globe in the past as being a continuum. And so it's really the formats in which knowledge has been created and preserved have changed over time. You saw cuneiform tablets in the Library of Ashurbanipal. We have cuneiform tablets which are almost 5,000 years old. So, the physical recording of knowledge is an ancient is an ancient thing. And today we have digital knowledge platforms, server farms, as well as the online platforms themselves. But the knowledge is contained in noughts and ones in software and hardware. And so the attacks on those are a continuum. It's just that the formats have changed. But the motivations and the effects of the destruction or those attacks remain and are very similar. And it's about controlling what people are able to access. It's limiting, in some cases, their ability to educate themselves. For example, in Bosnia, the National Library of Bosnia in Sarajevo was also the university library. And so that attempt to control what people think, control the past in order to control the future is what is happening today in the digital platforms. I think the element of neglect perhaps is slightly different. The cyber attack on the British Library, we think that was really motivated by financial reasons. But it was also a symptom of neglect that the library and the National Library of the United Kingdom had not put enough funding into their cybersecurity. And so we can see there are absolutely variations in the kinds of motivations and the kinds of the context for the attacks on knowledge in the digital domain. But many of them I see as being continuous from those past examples which I gave you.
Thank you.
Professor Ovenden, there are a couple of questions in the chat box. Susan M has a question. Should I read them out?
Oh, no, I can read it. So I can read it out. The other kind of censorship is by prevention of knowledge production itself. That's absolutely true. That will be an entirely separate kind of set of discussions. There have been some excellent recent books on censorship more broadly, particularly around knowledge production. I totally agree with you. I think they're very connected to the preservation of knowledge and the preventing people from accessing what is produced in terms of production. And I think the example that you cite there is, I would totally agree with it. And perhaps we can go to the question before in the chat from Ram, who's doing research on media and culture. How does the rapid digitization of libraries and archives impact the preservation of knowledge in traditional forms? Can this lead to further erasure or misrepresentation? And how can India balance modern education systems with the preservation of its rich? I assume you mean kind of, past knowledge. So rapid digitization, I think, is a very interesting phenomenon. It's certainly something we're doing here in the Bodleian. I think the important thing to say here is that it just creates another form of knowledge that needs to be preserved and protected. It can also help. I think, one of the elements of my book that is a thread throughout history is that a method of preservation is to copy knowledge, and digitization is a form of copying. So if originals are destroyed, having a copy keeps knowledge alive. And so digitization can play a role in that. There are programs like the Endangered Archives program, for example, that is helping to support digitization in places of the world where knowledge is vulnerable. But in copying, like digitization, choices have to be made, and so those who are making the choices are also about what to be digitized. So making choices for the future about what knowledge survives and what can be accessed by scholars or readers or members of society in the future, because it's selective. Unless everything is copied, you're making selective judgments, you're editing the past effectively. And so that comes with its own set of biases, its own set of, if you like, editorial decisions. And I think the kind of broader question of balancing modern education systems with the preservation of the past is a very, very difficult one to make when resources are limited. And I think, it's impossible to keep everything from the past. I don't think, if you spoke to an archivist, they would say, well, that's a mad idea, because archivists have been used to selecting, making, policy statements around the preservation of knowledge, what to preserve through retention and disposal schedules, the use of sampling in large record series. And it's a kind of absolutely fundamental question for a modern society, what to keep from its past in order to inform the future. And I guess my position on this is to err as much on the side of preservation as possible, but knowing that ultimately it has to be a balance.
There is a question right before by Dr. Shubhada Nagarkar. She wants to know about authenticity checks from the ancient to the contemporary times.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And I think that's part of the, if you like, function of libraries and archives in preserving the truth. I think authenticity is absolutely fundamental to that. I think the place of preservation, there's no point preserving something if it's not an authentic record. If it's going to be intervened with, if it's going to be altered, then the function of libraries and archives is undermined. And so there's a whole set of archival practices around authentic records, over and beyond the pure act of preservation, which are about authenticity checks. And I'm very involved in the digital preservation community, and they've developed their own set of digital forensic methods and policies and tools in order to ensure that authenticity. And we use, in the Bodleian, for example, we've developed a dashboard which constantly monitors our digital stores, our digital repository, and runs hashing and checksum routines against our files, almost constantly, in order to ensure that none of them have been interfered with or tampered. And in the past, you can see that through things like seals, through endorsements, official copies, metadata, I guess, have all been developed in order to try to put controls to support the authenticity of knowledge systems. And it's a very, very interesting topic, and I think people should be writing more about it. And you can see that in the modern age with things like blockchain technologies, for example, attempting to absolutely lock that authenticity down.
Thanks a lot, Professor Ovenden. We understand that you're taking time off your busy schedule, so we would not keep you here any longer. We are very grateful to you for accepting our invitation, and it was an honor and a pleasure to be hosting you here at the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the University of Hyderabad. Thanks a lot for that fascinating talk where you surveyed the burning of books and the destruction of knowledge from ancient times down till the contemporary age. So thanks a lot. It was fascinating, and I'm sure the audience did obviously learn a lot, which is evident from the questions and responses that we had. So thank you once again, and this is on behalf of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, which is Professor Pramod Kirnair at the Department of English in the University of Hyderabad, and the faculty fellow Dr. Anna Kudian, also Professor of English at the University of Hyderabad. Big thank you to you, and thanks to everybody in the audience. This talk is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel. So we urge you to check our website out as well as our YouTube channel. So thank you everybody for joining in, and we do hope that you will be part of the succeeding lectures and events being hosted by the chair. Professor Ovenden, once again, it was a real pleasure. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you for such excellent questions as well. Bye.